So Agnes Smedley is so fascinating that she deserves a book in itself, and there have been books written about her as well. So Agnes Smedley was an American working class woman. She grew up in a very poor family in Missouri, with an alcoholic dad and many siblings, and just generally a terrible family life. And she later became a journalist, and she met Lala Lajpat Rai in New York and was completely, influenced by him, not in a romantic way, in a mentor kind of way. And she began thinking about why can't India get independence and have a revolution in the same way that Soviet Russia has done? And which was quite a novel idea at the time. She got involved with with the Gadar movement, who were Indian revolutionaries who had gone to the US, mostly in California and the Pacific Northwest. And she met a lot of them, and she was very influenced by them. She At that time she was a complete Indophile. He met Emin Roy there and his first wife, Evelyn Roy, and she had, she knew of them. She, in fact, met Emin Roy before she met Chatto. He got involved in the Gadar movement, and the police came after her. Emin Roy escaped to Mexico, and Agnes Smedley escaped to Berlin because there were a lot of revolutionary Indians in Berlin at the time. And she came to Berlin to escape being arrested. There she met Chatto, and she fell head over heels for Chatto at the time, and they had a very tumultuous, passionate, but eventually horribly toxic and damaging relationship for years. They never married. She considered herself his common law wife, but they lived together. And here we come to the crux of all revolution, which is that it is very interesting, very easy to be a revolutionary on the streets. But can you be a revolutionary at home? Most people can't, and I would go so far as to say most men can't, because I've seen this in my previous book as well, in Lady Doctors, where men were very keen to talk about, you know, liberalization and education for women. But in practice, they just weren't able to live with a liberal and educated woman and with a woman who wouldn't be bossed about by them. They found it very hard. So this is exactly what happened with Agnes and Chatto. To begin with, she thought that Chatto would be a very open-minded, liberal, revolutionary person, but he wasn't. He had issues with her previous romantic relationships, previous boyfriends. In fact, she writes a very, heartfelt letter in which she says, Chatto just saw me as a walking vagina. And he was very jealous of all the previous relationships that I had had, even though he had had plenty of previous relationships, but he couldn't take me as a person now. Then Chatto began to use her mostly as a household slave because Chatto used to invite all the Berlin revolutionaries to his house and make Agnes cook and clean for them, at least according to her account. We don't have an account of what Chatto says. I wasn't able to find anything where he spoke about her. Okay, he didn't speak about her or write about her as far as I know, but she wrote to many people, and many other people have said that Agnes completely became a household drudge for Chatto. She did all the cooking, the cleaning. He took money from her. They lived in complete poverty in Berlin. It was a very difficult life. I should say also that Agnes had certain mental issues, and perhaps so did Chatto. Okay, it wasn't easy to live that life back then. And, they were constantly pursued by the police, living in poverty. And eventually, Agnes and Chatto parted ways. She left him. And he was very, very hurt by that. And he was very, very lonely. But she didn't want to be his. By that time, he had become very controlling and he wouldn't let her write. She was writing for all kinds of newspapers. She was a journalist and a foreign correspondent. Agnes left Chatto and went on to great things. She went to China. By this time, she had got completely fed up of the Indian nationalists because another very important point is that the Berlin Indians and other nationalists, they treated Agnes quite simply as a whore, as a kept woman, because she and Chatto were not married. So they treated Emin Roy's wife, Evelyn Roy, and later Ellen Roy with respect because they were married. And both Evelyn Roy and Ellen Roy were, sort of like good Indian wives. They subordinated the entire lives to the men. and they did not write anything. They just, encouraged their men and served as sort of unpaid secretaries and archivists. Whereas Agnes wanted a life of her own. And there is also an incident in her book that I write about. She wrote many books, but she wrote a book called Daughter of the Earth, which was a novel about her life, a fictionalized account of basically her life with the Indian nationalists. And in that, she writes about she was actually raped by an Indian revolutionary, one of the group, one of the Gadar group. She does not mention this person. She gives everybody fake names, and there are all kinds of theories. One theory is that it was a man called Harambalal Gupta, which seems to me the most convincing theory. He's not very well known, but he was part of the early Gadar movement. There is one biographer of Agnes Smedley has even said that it was M.N. Roy. I could not find anything to confirm this because there is nothing to confirm this. But it is a fact that M.N. Roy despised Agnes Medley and made her life very difficult. Uh, he even said that if Chatto had not got involved with Agnes Medley, he would have gone so much further and I would have been happy to work with Chatto. But this hysterical woman, he calls her all kinds of terrible things. He calls her, an evil genius, hysterical woman, a witch, or this or that. And all this smacks of this complete Indian chauvinism towards any woman who has her own life, who has her own relationships, who refuses to be a household drudge, who does her own writing, all that kind of thing. And M.N. Roy calls her a lot of names, and it's quite strange. And for some part of me thinks, why were you so, uh, you know, uh, outspoken against her, and why did you hate her so much? It's possible they could have had a relationship, okay? And neither of them talked about it, but she writes about it in a disguised way in her book. Her book is interesting as well, Daughter of the Earth. But he goes on talking about her in her memoir as a complete witch and all. And eventually, partly because of her, he elbowed Chatto out. And, he got in with Lenin and basically marginalized Chatto. So anyway, long story short, Smedley left Chatto. She went to China, where she became fascinated by Mao, who was a young man at the time, and the Maoist movement. And she became a first correspondent and marched with Mao with his Red Army in, the Mao blue fatigues and, Mao uniform. And eventually she became so enamored of China that when she finally died, she was buried in China, in Beijing, in the, a cemetery there for revolutionaries. And Chatto and Smedley met for one last time in Moscow, by which time, much time had passed and, they were amicable towards each other. And Chatto in Smedley actually writes very movingly of Chatto, and she says he's become old. He's in exile. He wants to return to India. He's very lonely, but he can't. And so he's, stuck between two worlds. And then they part. And Smedley never got to know about Chatto's execution. They just lost complete touch, and eventually she died. I think in a different time and in a different place, they could have had a very wonderful relationship, but both of them had terrible issues. So, I titled that chapter because Smedley said when she left Missouri, she said, I will never want to be like my mother, a household drudge, just, cooking and cleaning and looking after children. And she writes, live the life of a cabbage, I would not. And that's why she left Chatto. And luckily for her, she did not live the life of a cabbage, though I'm sure she led a quite lonely life because, no man of that time could put up with a woman like Agnes Smedley.